Hello and welcome to my channel. This is going to be another graphite pencil drawing of a fighter plane. This time I'm going to be drawing the F-16 Falcon. I'm going to use the same materials that I used for the MiG-21 drawing and pretty much the same approach. This is also going to be a vignette. I'll talk about that in a minute. So the paper I'm using is the Fabriano sketching paper, 9 by 11 inches, and the pencils are the Koh-i-Noor graphite pencils. I'm also going to use a touch of black colored pencil here and there for some of the darker details, just to get a little bit more range of value. I'm doing this sketch in a combination of freehand and ruler. And if you look at my reference, which will be in the description, you will see that it's a little bit different both in terms of the markings and insignia, but also in terms of the position of the aircraft, because I tilted it a little bit more towards our viewpoint. Anyway, I started shading the background here lightly using the HB pencil. And I'm going to shade it in such a way so that I leave some of the lighter shapes of clouds here and there. So, like the previous one, this one will also be a vignette. And what that means is that I will leave it looking semi-finished, at least in terms of the background. So I won't shade the entire background. I won't work all the way to the edge of the paper. But I will just add in a few clouds in the background, just to give my main subject a little bit of a background. So we're just going to have a few clouds here and there, and that I think will be enough to create a nice looking scene. I'm blending this with a Q-tip, just trying to get a little bit more value out of that HB pencil, because when you blend you kind of fill in all of those lighter spaces in between the marks and it gets a little bit darker. So it's probably going to be dark enough so that these lighter shapes of clouds would stand out, and that's all I want. I just need a few suggestions of clouds. I don't really need a very elaborate background. I'm now using the Tombow Mono Zero eraser to clean up the edges of some of these clouds, and these two don't have to be super detailed. I'm just using this to get a cleaner edge or a stronger edge to value. So once that is done, and you can see how the clouds are kind of fading and the whole background is kind of fading towards the edge of the paper. That's normally how I draw these vignettes. Here I tried experimenting a little bit with some darker and lighter shapes within those clouds, but I didn't really like it that much, so I decided to simplify it a little bit. Anyway, moving on to the main subject, which is the F-16 fighter plane. The reference I used was an F-16 from an Air Force other than the US Air Force. I wanted mine to look like the US Air Force F-16, so I will just change the colors and the markings a little bit. It doesn't have to be super accurate, and I'm not really known for a high degree of accuracy when drawing stuff like this, but you know, I'm going to make it fairly detailed. Now, the reason why I picked graphite pencils, just like I did with some of the previous drawings of planes, was because they're just better for smaller details. They're cleaner. Charcoal is better for something that requires less precision and that is a bit more impressionistic. This requires more cleanliness and accuracy, so graphite is a better choice here. So this nose area, or the tip of the nose area, is a little bit darker in color. That's where the radar is housed. And then most of the aircraft is kind of bluish gray or something, but Some parts of it are a little bit darker gray. I'll get to that later. Now I'm starting to work on the cockpit, and I'm going to shade it so that it's a little bit darker. And down the middle of it we have a nice reflection, so I'm going to work around that and reserve that lighter space so that that reflection of the cabin would stand out. And in order for it to stand out, it really needs contrast, so everything around it needs to be darker in value. Now, in terms of the grades or the softness of the pencils I'm using, I have a number of different grades from 2H to 8B, but like I already mentioned, I plan to use a touch of black colored pencil, like so, just for some of the darker details. I'm using it here for some of the darker parts of the cockpit area. I drew the head-up display and now the area around the pilot. Now I could do this with an 8B graphite pencil as well, but this is going to give me a little bit more depth, maybe a little bit more value. You don't have to use it, of course. If you like working in graphite and want to use graphite pencils exclusively, there's nothing wrong with that. I've done that for many years, but you know, sometimes it doesn't hurt to throw in something a little bit darker. The difference is barely visible, I suppose, but it's still there. It's going to make the drawing a little bit more three-dimensional, I suppose. And so far I mostly used that black colored pencil on the cockpit area, but there will be a couple of other dark shadow areas on the plane where I will use a little more of that black colored pencil. But for the most part I plan to use graphite pencils. Anyway, moving on to this intake area, which is below or under the fuselage rather. So the F-16 is a single engine jet plane, and it has this large intake under the fuselage. Some planes have double intakes on the sides. Some of them, like the MiG-21, which I drew previously, has it on the nose or around the nose area. And yeah, so the configuration can vary quite a bit. Anyway, this root extension of the wings here has it's casting a bit of shadow onto that part of the plane, because the light is coming from above, so the wings and everything else will be casting a shadow down onto the rest of onto the lower part of the fuselage and the engine area. So I'm blending that because I used touches of a black colored pencil, and that and the 8B and 7B as well. They create a little bit more texture, so you always have to blend them a little bit unless you want to create a texture. Sometimes you may want a slightly rougher texture, but most of the time you will blend. Anyway, now I'm trying to refine some of the details on some of these the weapons, the missiles. It's carrying these short-range air-to-air missiles at the tip of the wings, or at the end of the wings, and that large thingy behind the missile is a fuel tank, or I'm guessing it's a fuel tank, to increase the range of the aircraft. Anyway, I'm continuing by shading the rest of the fuselage here in the middle and to the right. And I first shaded it with a little bit of 2B. I'm also trying to follow the shape of the aircraft a little bit with my pencil strokes and to make sure that I capture those subtle transitions between lighter and darker areas. And of course, as you see, when you blend it, it gets a little bit darker. That's what I also mentioned when I was doing the clouds. When you blend, you fill in those lighter spaces between the pencil marks, and you get the impression that it's a little bit darker. But if you feel like it's still not dark enough, if you feel like you're not getting enough out of the pencil you've applied, well, then instead of using more pressure, you can maybe just try cross-hatching a little bit, which I will do at one point, to make some parts of the plane look a little bit darker. Or you can just use a darker pencil, or in the case of graphite pencils, that means a softer pencil, because the softer graphite pencils are darker. The darkest one that I have in the Koh-i-Noor range is the 8B. There are others. There are other brands where they have slightly different grades, and maybe grades that they claim are a little bit darker. And then there are also the Faber-Castell matte graphite pencils, which I've also used, but even though I do like them, they are good. I think that conventional graphite pencils, whether they are Faber-Castell or these Koh-i-Noor, they tend to blend better. They're just a little bit easier to move around and smudge, and they're easier to blend, in my opinion. Whereas the matte graphite pencils feel a little bit more like colored pencil. There's this thingy here under the fuselage near the tail area. It looks like something like a vertical stabilizer, but it's below the fuselage. I don't really know what it's for. I'm just describing some of the shapes. I'm not really an expert. I think I know a little bit more than the average person when it comes to aeroplanes, because that used to be my hobby when I was a kid. But like I said, I don't really know that much about every single detail and every single part of the aircraft. Anyway, so that part is a little bit darker, and I used an 8B for that because that's in the shadow. And I also made this wing here a little bit darker because I wanted to create contrast with the upper part or the upper side of the fuselage and that wing. And here I'm cleaning up some of the smaller shapes of these missiles. I'm just working around them, and now I'm adding some smaller details to the wings, just trying to make the drawing look a bit more detailed with a few of these touches, adding these details that I don't even know what exactly they are for. But like I said, I don't really need to know all of that. As long as I can get the shapes to look similar to what they're supposed to look like on an actual aircraft, I think it'll be acceptable. Anyway, here I started shading this part of the fuselage a little bit darker. Just going over it one more time with the 2B again, this time using a cross-hatching method. So I'll just make it a little bit darker, because from what I see from the reference photos of the US F-16s, much of the plane is in darker gray color. It has some sort of a dark gray coating. I don't really know the exact purpose of that, but once again, I don't really need to know everything. I'm just going to try to do it the way it is in the reference photos. And of course I have to blend that as well. I'm using a combination of a Q-tip and some brushes. Now, one of the things that you saw here, if you paid attention with the use of brushes, is that I almost always use flat brushes. I like to use flat brushes because they help me with the edges. I just point the flat tip of the brush towards the edge, and that way I can blend to that edge and not make it blurry. So it helps me to preserve clean edges to value while at the same time blending the areas that I need to blend. And another thing that you probably noticed here, because I suppose because of the complexity of the drawing, was that I moved it around quite a bit more than usual. I rotated it quite a bit more than I normally do in my drawings, because when I'm recording top down, I try to minimize the amount of rotating so that it would be easier for you to watch. But the truth is that sometimes it's a lot more comfortable to rotate the drawing at least a little bit, if not completely, so that you can work on certain shapes and certain edges a lot more easily. But I try to minimize that. Anyway, I'm working on this exhaust area, and what I want to do here is I want to not only capture some of the smaller moving parts, because it does have moving parts. I also want to capture its texture and reflectiveness, because it looks like a shiny reflective metal area. So I shaded the top and the bottom part a little bit darker, and then made this part here in the middle a little bit lighter, so that I could convey that metallic reflective appearance. And now I'm drawing all of these smaller moving parts there. I don't really know how interesting this particular subject or these types of subjects when I'm drawing planes are for the people who come to my channel, but I just find them fascinating. Like I've already mentioned, it's not that I'm a fan of war machines or anything like that. I see aeroplanes in much the same way that people who like cars look at cars. They're just fascinating machines to me, and I like drawing some of these shapes. I feel like it's a subject that's both kind of enjoyable for me to draw, but at the same time it's a good opportunity to practice, in my opinion, because you can practice just like with any other subject. You know, I mean, if you can practice by drawing still life vases and things like that, you can do the same thing by drawing these, in my opinion, far more interesting and far more complex subjects. Anyway, I'm now fidgeting with the vertical stabilizer here. The F-16 has a fairly large vertical stabilizer, and I'm just trying to find a way to establish the contrast between the stabilizer area and the wings behind it. As you can see, I simplified the clouds a little bit. I didn't really like the appearance of some of them. I thought that they were maybe a little bit too distracting. So like I said, I simplified them a little bit and focused on the greater contrast or larger contrasts. Now I'm doing the other wing and the missile on it. And after I'm finished with that, I'm just going to have to do the rest of the fuselage and the tail area here on the right. I'm shading this a little bit more, adding a bit more value to it, and some of these smaller details, but there's no need to overdo it. Here with this part of the tail area, I decided to make it darker, because initially my plan was to make the edge of it a little bit lighter so that it would stand out against the darker value of the wing. But I realized that I wasn't getting a very nice looking shape that way, so I decided to make the whole shape of that vertical tail or that vertical stabilizer a little bit darker. And I think that now it's a lot easier to understand the overall shape of the aircraft, and because of that it's a lot easier to see that it does actually look like the F-16 aircraft. I did a little bit more additional shading on that right side of the fuselage, and now I'm just going to add some numbers, some markings and insignia here and there to make it, let's say, semi-accurate. But like I said, I wanted to make it look like a US Air Force aircraft. I put my signature on the right side, and now the drawing is done. I hope you enjoyed the drawing process. and found it useful, please check out my other videos and let me know what you think. Now, if you want to see longer videos and a lot more content, you should check out my Patreon. Thanks for watching and bye bye.